Hey, thanks everyone for joining us for this town hall. It was about a year ago where everything was shutting down because of COVID-19. And so it has been amazing how much progress has been made, but we still have much more to do here over the next coming weeks, months, and year. And so with this community, we're hoping to do something different in terms of learning together about vaccines for SARS-CoV-2. And very pleased to have Rob Califf and Emily O'Brien join and share what is happening around this space and specifically around Hero Together and also other areas that are related. So Rob, you all may know from his days at Duke, as well as at the FDA as commissioner, and currently is at Verily and Alphabet. And Emily O'Brien, who's the PI for Hero Together, who's been leading the registry effort. So I'll turn it over to Rob to get things started. And as things go along, just a reminder, please enter any comments or questions in the chat. We'll be able to have a discussion at the end of the presentations. So Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. It's great to be here. I think Emily's going to lead it off, though, right, Emily?
That's right. Yes.
Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks to Rob for joining and helping present today. I wanted to say thank you also to this community for joining, and especially to those of you who are participants in the HERO program. I'm really excited to get to share with you some of what we've learned over the past year. It's incredible to think that it's only been a year. I think for many of us, it maybe feels like the longest year we've ever experienced. But from a research standpoint, it's been incredible to see the effort that various teams have put in to bring this program together and really to generate some data that I think are really informative, and we're excited to share with you today. So back in March 2020, is interesting. I took a look back at the front page of the New York Times just to get a sense of how prevalent COVID was on the news at that time. There was one mention of an outbreak on the front page. So we weren't at pandemic level yet, and there was a lot of focus on the Democratic primaries and acknowledgement of Joe Biden as a safe bet for the nomination. And so it was interesting to see sort of what we were thinking about at the time, and certainly, lots of increasing focus on COVID, and that seems to have continued throughout the past year and continues even today as there's more uncertainty about variants and vaccines that are coming on the market. So I'll say it's really been fantastic to work with PCORI on the registry. They've been very progressive in terms of getting this started quickly and really thinking about how to do research differently and in a way that really honors the sacrifice that many healthcare workers have made over the past year and really represents their perspectives in the science that we're doing. So in March 2020, PCORI funded the HERO program with the main objective to answer unaddressed questions related to COVID-19. At the time, everything was really a question. We weren't totally sure about how risk for the virus looked in different individuals, how risk for bad outcomes looked in people who got sick, and what therapies were most effective in the clinical setting. And so their idea really was to set up the infrastructure to allow us to answer those questions and to do so in a rapid way. Next slide. So those of you who are current HERO members know that the process is pretty iterative in nature. Our HERO registry asks any healthcare workers who are over 18 working in the US to join and to tell us a little bit about themselves through some quick surveys that they then answer sort of a set of more expensive set at the beginning and briefer surveys over time. And the idea here is that we're not just collecting data and then publishing on it. Certainly the academic output is important here, but we also want this to be a learning community where we're consistently checking in with healthcare workers, seeing how they're doing, and then refining our research priorities as a result of those conversations, and making sure that our science is most impactful for what healthcare workers care about. Next slide. So it's been interesting. We've had really great discussions with the healthcare worker subcommittee that represents a diverse set of professional roles within the healthcare worker population. And what we've heard from them is that there are many opportunities for healthcare workers to participate in research related to COVID, given their frontline essential worker status. One of the features that I think sets Hero apart and that has really made this an exciting project for many of us is that we have a broad definition of healthcare workers. So while many of the research studies that at least I've read in the literature are focused primarily on frontline or high-risk healthcare workers, we define healthcare worker as anyone who works in a setting where people receive healthcare. So this isn't just what we think of as a clinical care provider, but also people who work in roles like transportation, interpretation, food services workers, environmental services workers. At last count, I think we had about 12 chaplains who were represented. So it's a broad group, and really I think recognizes that the burden of the pandemic is borne by healthcare workers as a whole, not just those who are in the more sort of frontline settings. Next slide. So Josie Briggs, who's senior advisor to PCORI, had a nice quote that I think illustrates the reason for focusing on healthcare workers well, really acknowledging that they have a vital role in terms of treating the infection, but also that they're sort of central figures in their communities, often people who other people turn to for their perspective on emerging evidence and on risk prevention, et cetera. And so, this is a unique population and one that really plays a key role both within their professional setting as well as in their everyday lives. Next slide. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that the available data do suggest an increase in COVID risk in healthcare workers relative to the general population. So these are data from the UK and the US. From an app that tracked positive COVID tests. And as you can see in the pink bar, healthcare workers have a disproportionate representation in terms of the number of positive COVID-19 tests. This is published in Lancet Public Health last year. And this is consistent for the UK and in the US. Next slide. So again, a sort of unique feature of this program, in addition to thinking about infection risk and risk for adverse outcomes, positivity rates, more sort of conventional infectious disease outcomes, we also knew that prior to the pandemic, healthcare workers already were experiencing a greater degree of stress and burnout than the general population, and that this was likely to be exacerbated by the experiences of working in a pandemic and the uncertainties around their own risk and the risk that they might present to their families. So you've probably seen similar data like this in a number of different venues, but these are data from a Mental Health American National Healthcare Worker Survey, which found really astronomical rates of stress and anxiety, psychological burden and fear of exposing children and other family members among healthcare workers. So this is something that in some ways, I think healthcare workers have adapted to dealing with in their everyday lives, but really has reached a breaking point in the context of COVID and how it's changed their professional lives. Next slide. Victor Zhao wrote a nice piece on this that was published in the New England Journal. And I liked this analogy that, when we think back to the post-September 11th period in 2001, 2002, there was a focus on really supporting first responders and understanding the long-term health effects of the exposures that they experienced in their professional capacities from that day and from the response. And that, we have a similar responsibility now to take care of our clinicians and our broader healthcare worker population, that these are really first responders to COVID. They've experienced not only increased infection, but again, increased psychological outcomes from this, and those are likely to continue to increase over time. So we really need to understand this and provide the support that was really overdue at the start of the pandemic and is even more urgent now. Next slide. So here, the HERO registry set out to really do that, again, through observational research, asking people how they were doing over time, but also by connecting them with research opportunities that might be of interest to them. And again, to try to make sure that the priorities that they had were represented in those research opportunities, and it wasn't just sort of science for science's sake. The hot topics polling has been a really key piece of this, and I'll show some data from one of those polls in a minute. But in the late summer, we said, well, we had this nice set of questions that we put in our protocol and we asked at the beginning, but things change so quickly. Is there a way for us to check in on what people are talking about now and set up a mechanism to do this as we go, acknowledging that what used to be important and what was important last week might not be important to healthcare workers this week. And so every month we send out a question to our registry participants and say, tell us what you think about this hot topic. So we've asked about childcare, we've asked about vaccine hesitancy, which I'll talk about in a second. We've asked about financial burden, things that really try to, again, recognize that these are human beings who have pressures and stresses outside of what they experience in their professional lives, and those need to be understood and represented here as well. Next slide. So this is our baseline survey question. Adrian came up with this idea, which I thought was really phenomenal to set us up for doing this well. Really simple, just ask people, what issues do you care about? What's most pressing on your mind right now? And the next slide shows a breakdown of what this looked like over time. So again, acknowledging that that things change rapidly, we did see that bear out in the free text responses that are represented from the word clouds here. In early spring, as you all remember, PPE and testing were much more limited than any of us wanted them to be. This came up consistently. In the summer, there was lots of discussion about masks. This initial change from thinking that masks may not be necessary to really widespread recommendations based on the science that masks were effective and really should be prioritized even for people who didn't work in high-risk settings. And then throughout the fall, what was striking to me is that PPE was still brought up as a topic of interest. People were saying we still are lacking the supplies that we need to be protected here. And it's amazing that we're dealing with this still months down the line. And then, as you might expect, over the past couple months, things have shifted really to questions about vaccines. Lots of mention about stress and burnout, which unfortunately we expected given the toll that this has taken on healthcare workers over the past year. So again, this parallel pandemic in terms of psychological burden is going to be increasingly important for us to not only understand, but mitigate. Next slide. So in thinking about vaccine questions that would be important to healthcare workers, we started with a sort of snapshot, a look at where we are. So this is where we are as of yesterday. The good news is we do have 6 vaccines globally that have been approved for use, 3 in the U.S. as of the past week. And so it's been incredible to see this progress and to see the incredible really safety and effectiveness profiles, at least from phase 3 clinical trials. Next slide. And acknowledging again that vaccines and natural immunity are really the only path back to normality, whatever we think that might be. But that as the uptake of vaccines increases, that we can get to a point where we can control outbreaks in the way that we really should have been doing it all along, and really get out of this scenario of uncontrolled spread, which is much more challenging to manage and has obviously much greater detrimental impact on population health as a whole. Next slide. And so, of course, there's been a lot of projections to demonstrate how this could look over the coming year. And what we see is that it's a direct function of the daily vaccination rates. And that's a number that is influenced by, of course, increasing capacity, but also the willingness of people to take vaccines, which we've seen shift around a lot over the past couple months. And we were interested in examining this in HERO, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. So vaccine hesitancy, I think, has always been in the back of our minds, but has become increasingly important as we've started to learn more about new variants. So I like this quote from Stephen Hoge from Moderna: "The virus is not going to stand still, and this is expected. You know, when we're in a pandemic with the virus circulating for this amount of time, this number of infections, we should anticipate that there are going to be concerning mutations that come along at some point, and the vaccine is really the key strategy for trying to get us to a point where those don't have ability to spread and really cause the impact that they could. Next slide. So this is just one version of there are lots of these tables. There's a particularly nice one, actually, that Dr. Fauci presented yesterday on the White House COVID-19 task force update, and is slightly more comprehensive with 2 additional variants from California and New York. But these are the 3 that have really been sort of most concerning based on early evidence suggesting that they may be associated with increased death risk, increased transmissibility, and possible decreased vulnerability to antibodies. Early vaccine effectiveness assessments suggest that the vaccines may be effective for some of these, but we're gathering additional data to ensure that that's the case. And really, you know, as we think about our path forward, this is going to be a key area of focus for really refining our strategy for prevention. Next slide. It's actually been encouraging over the past couple of weeks, maybe not so much over the past couple of days. We've seen throughout late January, February, some pretty striking declines in case rates, particularly in, you know, settings like nursing homes, where there's been vaccine uptake that really has corresponded pretty well with drops in both infection rates as well as death rates due to COVID-19. Recently, we have seen resurgences. These are just a few countries from areas from outside of the United States that have been experiencing this over the past few weeks. This is something obviously that we want to avoid, and vaccination is a key method for us to try to get this under control before these have a chance to take hold. Next slide. So when we think about you know, ways that we can enhance vaccination, as I mentioned, you know, this is a function of a number of different factors. It's been really encouraging to see the increase in distribution, supply, and really convenience for people. You know, many different settings where people can now be vaccinated, not just limited to major health systems. So that's been encouraging over the past several weeks, and sounds like that will continue over the coming months. But really, you know, when we think about the downstream determinants of the decision to be vaccinated, what people think and feel is really a key component and a key driver of their motivation. And so having available vaccine is one part of it, but making sure that people are comfortable with the decision and confident in their decision is a really key driver, which is where we've been really focusing in HERO recently. Next slide. So when people you know, tell us about what they're concerned about, what we see in HERO, as I'll show, really lines up nicely with what's seen in broader populations. So these are data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, which has done a number of really helpful and illustrative polls in this space. The percent of people who say that they are concerned, either very or somewhat concerned about adverse effects related to vaccines, the majority of them are saying, you know, we don't know what the long-term effects of these vaccines are. And so on the next slide, I think I show how, okay, we'll get there. But I think what's important to recognize here is that, you know, there is a degree of hesitancy that's sort of underlying all of this, but that a lot of it is clustering around the lack of data related to long-term effects. Next slide. So often hesitancy is sort of thought of as binary, willing or not willing. I think what's important to note is that vaccine hesitancy is definitely a continuum. So you have, you know, on the one side, people who have high demand for vaccines, likely to accept all vaccines. On the other side of the spectrum would be people who are so-called vaccine deniers or vaccine refusers, who are unlikely to take any vaccine, no matter how safe or effective it's shown to be. But the majority of people that we think of as hesitant are really here in the middle. People who might accept vaccines but have lingering doubts, people who might accept or might take a wait and see approach, refuse some vaccines but not all, and that's really the target for thinking about how to improve uptake more broadly. Next slide. So these are the data from HERO. We were very interested through our Hot Topics polling to see what this looked like. I think many of us thought healthcare workers are sort of closer to the science in some ways, and maybe more comfortable with medical intervention more broadly. Surely they'll be more vaccine willing than general populations. What we saw in our initial poll in October was that was not true, at least not true for some of the professional roles that were represented in our population. So we saw about 54% of people who said, yes, I'd be willing to take a vaccine that were available to me at no cost, approved under EUA. This did increase in December. We repeated the poll with exactly the same language. We saw about a 22% increase overall in willingness. But interestingly, we saw a lot of variation across roles. So the most willingness was among paramedics, EMTs, and physicians, and the lowest willingness among nurses. But encouragingly, we did see improvements in all of the professional role categories over time. As many of you know, November was a very active time. We had a national election, and we also had press releases from the two leading vaccine candidates, both of which now have EUA approval, that showed very high effectiveness of those vaccines. So it may have been that having something sort of tangible to think about when answering this question improves reported willingness. Next slide. And so these are data again that correspond very well with what was found in the Kaiser Family Foundation poll, which is that concerns about safety were prominent among people who said that they would not take the vaccine under EUA. We did not ask about lack of long-term data specifically, but it stands to reason that having long-term data on safety would help to reassure people who have those concerns. Next slide. So I do want to talk for a minute about hesitation more broadly, and how actual vaccination rates have looked over the past few weeks. Certainly, polls are helpful for measuring intent, but then we need to think about what's actually happening and what uptake actually looks like. So not all states report data by rate, but we see some interesting patterns when we look at states that do report vaccination data by race. And really what we see is that vaccination patterns among Black individuals is at odds with the burden of COVID-19 in Black populations. And so when you look at North Carolina, for example, Black individuals represent 25.7% of COVID cases, only 10% of vaccinations, and 21.3% of the total population, 25% of deaths. So sorry, 20.4% of cases and 25.7% of deaths. So certainly disproportionate burden here, and this does bear out in the other states that had race-specific data that they reported. Next slide. So again, thinking about the spectrum of hesitancy, it's not always just yes or no. This wait and see perspective has been something that has come up frequently in the research that Kaiser and Family Foundation and other groups have done on this. And what we see is that there's a ton of variation, as you might expect, by demographics as well as by political leanings. So the most wait and see reporting among people who are younger, Blacks and Hispanics, more likely to report waiting to see if the vaccine is safe, as well as urban residents and Republicans. Again, thinking about, what can we do to improve some of these disparities and hopefully reassure people that this is safe. Knowing where the hesitancy burden lies is really an important component of that. Next slide. The AMA has done really an incredible job with their Prioritizing Equity series, focusing on the determinants and potential solution to lack of trust in vaccines, which is an issue that has been demonstrated before, but has really come into view sharply during COVID, acknowledging that mistrust is not about just one single misstep in research in the past, but really about lived experiences now. And if we're going to really think carefully and thoughtfully about enhancing confidence, it has to be through really identifying connections with trusted messengers, having conversations, telling stories, and maybe translating data in a way that is really meaningful and really demonstrates to people that that this is a priority, and also that the concerns of their communities are really guiding a lot of these studies. Next slide. We do see some shifts over time that I thought were sort of interesting to note. The breakdown on this slide is by urban, suburban, and rural setting. And so what we see is that there's been an increase in people who've reported that they've already gotten the vaccine or will as soon as possible among people in urban settings and suburban settings, slightly lower increases in people who live in rural settings, and the definitely not percentages have stayed pretty stable in the suburban and rural settings, but have declined both overall as well as in urban settings. Next slide. Political affiliation is another determinant, as you might expect. What we see here is that there's been a increase in the proportion who say that they've already gotten the vaccine or will soon, and a decline in the wait and see approach among Democrats. Smaller shifts among independents, but still heading in the right direction, but really no change at all in Republicans. Next slide. So, obviously this has been really a tricky year in terms of misinformation, which was an issue pre-COVID, and I think has been at least more visible to all of us in the context of the work that we've done with COVID. Lots of information that misinformation that we're fighting against, and I think the super spreading depiction of this is really the right one, that these things have the ability to take hold quickly and to spread quickly. Next slide. I do want to point out that this was true and well documented even prior to COVID. So these are actually is pretty chilling to think about this in 2018, before COVID and all the misinformation associated with COVID was really so prominent. But even before the pandemic, there were analyses such as this one of 4.5 million tweets from 2006 to 2017 that I think were really a warning sign for what could come. This study found that falsehoods were much more likely to diffuse to broader audiences, to diffuse more quickly, farther and faster and deeper than things that were true. And so this is something that we're seeing play out in real time, and has real effects on hesitancy, and I think really underscores the need for data from robust science and robust studies that really can tell us something meaningful about what the risks actually are, as opposed to some of these sources of misinformation. Next slide. There's been some good progress. Obviously, this needs to be a multi-pronged approach. This is from, I believe this is from Monday. Twitter now has a strike system to deal with vaccine misinformation. So repeated strikes can lead to accounts being locked. So this is on the sort of defensive side, and we like to think of our work as hopefully being proactive and producing information that can help people be reassured about safety. But certainly it's important for us to be aware of what's happening more broadly, and think about how to best position our findings in the context of this. Next slide. Okay, this is the last slide before I'll turn it over to Rob. I think that the key here is to acknowledge that hesitancy is just one component of the determinants of vaccine uptake. It is an important one. It is one that is going to continue, and I think as many of you have probably seen from your own experiences, that people are willing to change their minds about this, and people are interested in information from trusted sources, and will reach out and ask your thoughts on things like vaccine safety. And so we feel it's absolutely critical to have evidence that we can point to help reassure people that these vaccines are safe in the long run, and hopefully improve vaccination uptake and get us out of this pandemic. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
Great, thanks, Emily. I mean, your overview just shows how complicated the mix of biology, clinical medicine, culture, communication, all involved as we try to work our way through this pandemic. So I think you've made the case that there's a real need for all of us to pitch in to take care of ourselves, but also generate the information that other people will need to navigate through the pandemic. And make no mistake about it, my grandfather was a Baptist minister, so I used to watch the collection plate passed around when I was a kid. And my goal today is to get you to sign up for the post-marketing surveillance registry, because I think there's a minimal amount of work, but working together, we can contribute extremely useful information. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to race through the slides here because I think you know most of this, but I want to paint the picture of where I hope we'll be going. Certainly in my role at the FDA, you know, every product has a life cycle. The vaccines certainly do. There's been a tremendous amount of work. 10 years worth of work was essentially compressed into about 10 months in the case of the currently available vaccines. And I think this figure gives short shrift to the post-market time frame, which is really much, much longer than anything else depicted here and critically important. Next slide. Why does phase 4 matter? Well, one thing is to ensure the benefits outweigh the risks over time. Remember that under an EUA, which is regulation put into place to deal with national emergencies, it has to be declared by the president. That gives the FDA tremendous latitude and authority to make decisions without the usual evidence that you would require. So in this case, there was only 2 months of follow-up from the clinical trials when the EUA was granted. So we got a lot to learn yet in this post-market phase. It also enables us to look across the whole population, get much deeper information about side effects and adverse events, and determine whether adverse events are directly linked to the vaccine by follow-up. And I hope you'll play a key role in that. Next slide. Just to make the point in a couple of quick slides, we're all concerned about asymptomatic infection. There's been a lot of talk in the press, and I've certainly in my role at Alphabet, where we've had, by the way, 400 billion downloads of information about COVID. That's just a number that's hard to even imagine. Now that many more of us are getting vaccinated, particularly healthcare workers, we're not 100% sure that the vaccines are completely effective in preventing asymptomatic infection and transmission. I got to say, it's looking pretty good. I'm out in Denver now visiting my grandkids now that Letty and I are both post-vaccination. So it's looking good, but we still have a lot to learn about the dynamics of the virus in people who have already been vaccinated. And I'd have to say, if the Denver airport is any indication, we're still going to see a lot of COVID over the next few months. Next slide. Also make the point that biology is just amazing, and what we're learning is tremendous, but we're learning as we go. This is just a look at the genealogy of the variant. So when we show these simple, easy to digest pictures like Emily showed, behind it is a very complex mix of multiple mutations happening all the time in a stochastic fashion. And without post-marketing surveillance, we're just not going to be able to keep up with how vaccinated people fare in this ever-changing climate where the virus is continuing to take us on. Next slide. And then, of course, we're getting multiple vaccines. There are multiple on the market already, with more to come. We're all trying to understand what the different results mean, remembering that the trials have been done at different times in different countries with different variants, making it impossible to draw a firm conclusion from indirect comparisons. And in the post-market phase, I think we'll get distinct signals about whether there are differences in how protected we are as time goes on by the different vaccines. Next slide. And of course, the fundamentals of the vaccines are quite different. I was not shocked, but a little surprised to see the Catholic Church come out saying, don't use the J&J vaccine if you have a choice. And you're a Catholic. You know, we've done it when I was at FDA. I got to see how much work goes on that deals with these kinds of issues, and It's certainly not a concern of mine, but the point is that mixed in with all the biology and the manufacturing are cultural beliefs that we're all going to have to navigate together. And I think the more transparent and explicit we are about these things, the better we'll do. Next slide. And of course, we got to put the data in context. Everything that happens now shows up in the press immediately, well before the academic information is digested. So the early allergic reactions made big press, and here we learned that out of the first 5 million vaccinated, there were just a handful of serious allergic reactions. And of course, the J&J vaccine doesn't have any yet reported. So, you know, we're going to learn a lot more as we get millions of people vaccinated. And certainly an intense look at 20,000 as planned in this post-market registry will be critical. Next slide. And we got to keep the risk in perspective. And this is, I think, something that just points to the difficulty of numeracy and probabilities as we go about our day-to-day life. We accept certain things implicitly just because we're used to them. Other things that are rare, like vaccine adverse events, play a much bigger role in our thinking. And I hope that through this registry and the creation of a community, we can be ambassadors for making sense out of all these numbers, which I think are bewildering to the average person. And as we saw in the data, have led to significant hesitancy even in the healthcare worker community. Next slide. And of course, there are actually things that happen. So, you know, we've mostly couched this in terms of reducing hesitancy and giving people confidence, but we should always acknowledge that we did only have 2 months of follow-up in limited populations. And so as we learn, it's going to be very important to not be biased and to look carefully at adverse events. And that's certainly planned in our registry as one part of this. Next slide. So the rationale is that, you know, as you all know, healthcare workers have been at the cutting edge of getting vaccinated first. The EUA doesn't cover everything that we need to know. And so there's a really strong rationale for more detailed long-term follow-up. Next slide. So HERO Together is an observational study that's open to healthcare workers, meant to monitor both the short and long-term safety and outcomes and to create a community. Next slide. And it's meant to go on over 2 years. So there are 2 ways to get into it. The easy way is if you're already a member of the HERO registry, joining up with HERO Together is easy and very brief. If you're starting from scratch, it takes less than 20 minutes, but as I'll show you, we're collecting a good bit of data that will be extremely useful, both to you and to other people, we hope. So there are ways to get into the registry, even if you're not yet part of the overall HERO effort. Next slide. This is just a look at the types of data that we're collecting. Most of it is self-report, but we want to make sure that as time goes on over the next 2 years, we have a group of people who are committed to being in a community that keeps track of what's going on and that gets access to return of results so that we can all think about this together. Next slide. This community is already underway, over 20,000 in the HERO registry altogether, and we want to get 20,000 in HERO Together with much more detailed follow-up in this post-vaccination cohort. Next slide. There's some pretty good folklore to go with this. I particularly point you to the upper left-hand corner if you want to see the skills that Adrian Hernandez has at karaoke. You'll get to see him in action. And of course, I think Mariah Carey is about as good as it gets in terms of a song there at the bottom right. Not to make light of the other videos here, but I think it, you know, there's a culture growing around this, which is going to be really important as we try to get through this together. Next slide. So I hope you'll sign up. We're going to go into a Q&A now. There's ample time. You can sign up during the Q&A. Just go to your browser and get to HERO Together and get signed up. We'll take less than 20 minutes if you're starting de novo and less than 10 minutes if you're already in the overall registry. Next slide. some people are asking, well, gee, my institution already has a special study, or I'm participating in BSAFE. And I've certainly myself am participating in both BSAFE and HERO together. This is really a lightweight registry without a whole lot of work, and doesn't interfere with any other kind of protocol that you may be participating in. We would really like to get people who are pregnant. I've had relatives contact me just in the last 24 hours. I'm pregnant, should I get the vaccine? And we really need more intensive information about these sorts of things. Next slide. So here are the 5 main reasons that we came up to join up. We need the data, and I want to stress it's not just for building confidence in combating misinformation. It is for detecting if problems do crop up. The results will be returned to you so that you'll be on the cutting edge of knowledge about this. There also will be derivative study opportunities. I think there's a very high probability there'll be a deep immunologic study for those who want to know about their own immunologic profiles. And we're also asking you to tell us what the research priority should be. This is really an inherent property of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute effort. I was proud to be part of that at the beginning, and I'm really glad to see it continuing. And your time is valuable. Now, certainly some kinds of health workers are in a low income category, and the $200 is absolutely critical. For others, it's just an effort to make sure that your information is considered valuable to everyone else, and therefore there is funding for this. Next slide. So don't miss your shot. Join up. I hope you'll do it during the Q&A. And now we'll go to the next slide, which I think is last. We'll now turn it over to Adrian for the Q&A.
All right. Emily and Rob, thanks for giving an overview of everything, and also what's the kind of latest data coming out of this. So let me just start off with if you notice at the beginning of the vaccinations, there are all these vaxies that went out on social media. And how do you compare or contrast, the vaxies sharing, someone getting their shot and taking a picture and all the emotions around that, to what's being done here for the long term? Emily, I'll start with you, and then
Sure.
Your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say from from a public health perspective, I think obviously getting vaccinated yourself is important, and sharing that and really sort of making it visible can just in and of itself enhance confidence. So it's, I'll say that I think most people are excited to see the vaccines as a way to really build like this online community of people who were saying, yes, I believe this is safe. I believe it'll be effective, and that's why I'm taking this. But also from a public health perspective, doing sort of doing your part in terms of contributing data and really, being part of some of these efforts to evaluate long-term outcomes post-vaccine is another important contribution. And so I would see, the vaccine is the first step, and hopefully here together participation is the second step. And that to me would be a very strong contribution as a whole.
Yeah, I guess Rob, maybe put it in this way. It's like the vaccine is kind of like that one picture. And is this a movie? Is this what we're?
Well, obviously you have an analogy in mind, Adrian. I think it's a pretty good one. And I would just say, it's intrinsic, I think, in the healthcare professions that you want to help other people. And setting an example through the photos was a good thing to do, to say we're out there getting vaccinated. But I think in the long run, the most important thing is to contribute information and knowledge that can then guide everyone else. So, I'm definitely passing the plate here. You should contribute by signing up now. You can be completely signed up before the Q&A session is over.
Right. So maybe the analogy is really the next Netflix, multi-episode, multi-year that we're, as opposed to just a picture. So Kevin Haynes asked an interesting question. I'll turn this to Rob, especially in your prior role at FDA. Essentially, when you're either a regulatory decision maker or a healthcare system leader or others, how do you rely on data in this space? Is it a single data set? Is it a multi-pronged approach? I mean, what's the behind the scenes decision making that people have in that set? So, and Kevin puts it very clearly in this context, what's happening with BEST, what's happening with VAERS, and so forth. So.
Yeah, so there's a tapestry of data, and it all each component contributes something different. And you look for a commonality across the data sets and signals that might arise from one thing compared to another. You know, for example, BSafe, which has been painless for me. I've enjoyed answering the texts when they come from BSafe, but it's anonymous and there's not deeper follow-up that can go on. But in terms of giving us a signal about how rare the serious adverse events were in the early phase, I think it was amazingly valuable. We had over 1 million people reporting in, you know, within the first 6 weeks of starting to vaccinate. Then, of course, we've got things like VAERS, which and electronic health record consortia of other types, which are going to give us deeper information, but also anonymous. And then, you know, I think one of the great things about HERO is if we find that there is an issue, we have the capability of recontacting people to see, you know, are you interested in giving us deeper information from your own records, or even coming back in to be studied maybe with deeper biology. Let's say there's an adverse event that crops up and we need that extra information. So the regulator's looking at everything and also comparing across countries. There are calls and communications that go across international boundaries about these issues. So no one registry can do it all. We need the whole tapestry.
Maybe kind of along these lines, Emily, if you could comment, you know, a lot of these efforts are around the, you know, those only who got vaccinated, and some people will have life events over time. So how does the HERO program put things in context, those who get vaccinated and those who don't?
Yeah, this is going to be a really important part of our analysis, and BEST actually has ongoing work. And what I thought when I saw it, I was pretty impressed. Really nice, detailed protocol for generating background rates that can help give us some context. So our analytic plan actually directly integrates those as a first step. Before we get to any direct comparisons, we're going to take a look at the rates that are generated from that initiative and see if ours are outside of what we would expect. It's interesting because there are lots of events, and part of the concern is that some of those events have changed during COVID, even due to reasons not to do with actual infection rates. And so BEST has a really thoughtful approach to this, as I mentioned, and we're glad that we can leverage that for some of our analyses too.
And I guess this ties into kind of Rob's comment about the tapestry data that no one ever wants to rely on a single point or a data point. Is that right? Let me turn to perhaps a bit of a touchy subject, privacy. And someone asked here, how invasive information-wise is this, and what are the protections? And Rob, you sit on this kind of topic from multiple views, and so as a participant, but also in a space where this is constantly being addressed. So, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, as I think people probably would expect, this particular registry is, you know, occurring in a background of PCORI, the patient-centeredness, but also in a regulatory context. So it's being watched by a lot of people because it is does need to be compliant with rules and regulations related to submission of information to the FDA. But in general, the privacy safeguards, I think, are profound in this particular case. Like any such study, I mean, the information is in a database which is managed by the DCRI, and you know, will not be shared without people's permission on an identifiable basis. but within the study, like any clinical study, if let's say that you have an adverse event and you report it, there may be follow-up directly to you from the DCRI. So, I think almost everyone in this call is probably familiar with clinical studies and the way they work, but the information is being very carefully safeguarded and very adherent to the regulations.
All right. So Emily, let me ask, it's kind of related to this, but the concept of returning value to either participants or healthcare systems. How do you see that happening for HERO? What do people get, like in terms of information or other things? You highlighted this a little bit, but interested in what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we recognized early on is that value is subjective and can vary across populations, and that different participants might be interested in sort of different things. And so a couple of the key sort of value propositions, if you will, that we pointed out are, the first that we see as maybe one of the most powerful is the ability to really help drive the research agenda of the program. And that's something that is, a concept that PCORI has championed for over a decade now, and we see really as a central feature of this program, again, asking people what they're concerned about and being directly responsive to that as we decide what projects to take forward. Many people have said, I'm interested in learning what you're learning from my data. What can you give back to me? And so we've tried to think more creatively and broadly about how we disseminate, again, acknowledging that, contributing scientific papers, academic manuscripts is one important piece. Also important to make sure that, we can translate that information in something that's quick and readable and gets to the major points without being buried in a journal or behind a paywall. So we've done a lot of that through our website, heroesresearch.org, where we have quick summaries of the projects that are coming out of HERO, as well as what we're finding from hot topics. The other thing people said is that, I see a lot of information out there just about COVID in general, but I'm really interested in your thoughts on this topic. And can you all just tell me what you're hearing about this? And so we've tried to be responsive to that also through the blog with just quick write-ups of what's known about our particular subject, acknowledging again that these things change with time, but really, trying to be a trusted source of some of the key things that people care about. So we'll continue to do that. We're always interested in ideas for how to do that better. But again, the idea is that we're learning together and that it's not just one directional where people give us data and then they don't see anything back from it.
Okay. Let me ask, Rob, you've spent some time talking about kind of variants and what may happen now. Like, how do you see this playing out over the next year? And what's the role for these different data sources and Euro Together as well? So do you have any forecasts?
Yeah, as part of my job, Adrian, I do a daily update for the workforce at Verily. And I have, for obvious reasons, I have access to a lot of streams of information and what pundits and non-pundits and researchers think, in addition to our own global data, because Alphabet obviously is a global company dealing with exchange of information of up to 4 billion people a day. And, I think, we're in this really fascinating phase right now where I think there's a great sense of enthusiasm that we're seeing drops across the world and in the US in rates and hospitalizations and deaths. But at the same time, as Emily pointed out, we're seeing this plateauing in the US in particular, but also an uptick in several other countries as people relax the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And of course, this is harboring an environment. One great lesson at FDA was what's called One Health, and it's the idea that animals and humans live in a continuum and essentially a biological substrate that's dominated by viruses and bacteria. I have to admit, a couple of times I wondered when I got to see all of it within the government whether we as humans are just artifacts of the need for bacteria and viruses to have a host to live in. And of course, with travel and commerce around the world, you could see plasmids, for example, move from Southeast Asia to the US in a very short period of time. And so it's the more infections we have, the greater the virus has a chance to mutate. And as I showed in that genealogy, it's really complicated. And so I'll make a prediction that participants in this registry probably will have a chance to contribute significantly to the biological information that we're going to need, because ultimately the best bet, I think, is that we'll be in an endemic phase where we'll need to have booster shots and continually updating biological antibodies for treatment of people who get sick. And none of us know how long the vaccine immunity is going to last and how often updates will be needed. So this kind of a registry, I think, is a critical component of that effort so that we can get back to seeing our grandkids and other things like I'm doing now.
Hey, Rob, we just have one or two more minutes. You mentioned grandkids here, and I'm curious what you think are going to be the role of understanding pods or families or households in this effort.
It's already been a critical issue. And in fact, a lot of the disparities that were initially seen related to how closely people live together in multi-generational households. So I think as we go through this next phase and schools are getting back in and there are these different rates of infection and transmission, understanding what happens in the intense interaction of a household is absolutely going to be critical. And it's human to want to touch each other, no matter how much we profess to being perfect in our NPIs. It's going to happen, so we expect that. So I hope, I was just thinking, Adrian, if everybody on this call signed up and got 10 healthcare workers to sign up, we'd be 5% or 10% done with a registry today. But if families could sign up, we could have 20,000 people very quickly that would enable us to move along with the information that we need.
Yeah, so in other words, try to take the exponential effects that people have with their networks. So, Emily, I'll give you the last word here. So, what's your kind of parting words of advice for everyone?
First, to say thank you for all that you've done so far this past year, and again for being frontline workers as well as filling roles of trusted sources of information in your communities and for your roles in your families as well. And we hope that you'll continue to learn alongside us, and that we can help build confidence together as part of this community.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining this session, and please reach out with any questions or ideas. So I appreciate everyone's time and look forward to continue the conversation.
Yeah, and as you're leaving, think about signing up 10 friends. That would be the best thing you could do today. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.